Sul nostro canale abbiamo già pubblicato 2 video sul tema della creazione e dell'evoluzione. Sono video brevi nel quale abbiamo trattato argomenti del quale in realtà non sappiamo tantissimo, però che hanno sollevato tante risposte e anche un bel po' di polemiche.
Quindi questa volta abbiamo pensato di avere una conversazione insieme invitando qualcuno che ne capisce un po' più di noi. E purtroppo la persona che abbiamo invitato non parla italiano, viene dall'Inghilterra. E quindi questa live da qui in poi, questa conversazione verrà portata avanti in inglese, però potrete seguirla seguendo i sottotitoli in italiano. Quindi invito subito Professor Richard Bugs sullo schermo con noi.
Hi Richard.
Good morning,
Hello.
Richard.
Good to be with you.
It's good to have you here. Professor Richard Bugs studied at Cambridge, plant science, and then did his PhD in Oxford before moving to the University of Florida to do his first researches there as a doctor. And then he moved back to the UK and started working at Queen Mary University, where he's currently a professor. He also does his researches at the Botanic Garden, Kew, in London. And so it's a pleasure to have him here with us, a real expert in evolution and a Christian, we may say, from beginning that we invited a fellow Christian to help us dig more into this issue of evolution and Christianity.
So we're going to have a number of questions for you, Richard. Thank you again for being with us. And the first question I want to ask you is, can you tell us about your research? What's your area of expertise?
Sure, yeah. So I work in genetics and genomics. Genomics is studying the whole of the DNA of an organism. I use methods that are widely used on humans and animals and plants. Most of my research is on trees. I mainly work on British broadleaf trees like oak and ash and elm and birch. And we're trying to understand their evolution, their history, and their adaptation to climates, and also how they can respond to pests and pathogens. You know, in Europe, we have a lot of new pests and pathogens that are killing our trees. And my research is trying to understand how much genetic variation there is within our natural populations of these trees that gives them resistance, and whether we can then do a breeding program to try to give them more resistance. So the research is quite applied, but a lot of the fundamental questions are very pure science to do with evolution, to do with genetics. Or, you know, when Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, a lot of what he wrote about was what people have discovered in breeding programs. And so this is all very relevant to the issue of evolution.
Yeah. So we may say that you are an expert when we talk about evolution and genetics, which is why we are pleased to have you here to help us understand more. And you have been invited to give the inaugural lecture at your university, which I suppose it's a big honor, on the topic or on the title "Trees of Life: Do They Exist?" It has got some views on YouTube and some responses. Yes, we can link this lecture to you who are watching these videos. You can go later on and see what was that Richard said.
And the link will be in the description of the video if somebody wants to watch it.
But for now, I want to ask you, Richard, why did you give that lecture, and what were the points that you were making?
Well, when someone becomes a professor in a British university, they're normally invited to give a lecture to the public and to the university about their research. I should say that professor means something a bit different in Britain than it does in America. In America, anyone who teaches in a university is called a professor, but in Britain, it's what the Americans would call a full professor. So I was invited to give this lecture, and the vice principal for science and engineering, who is the person in charge of my part of the university, was very interested in the fact that I was both a Christian and doing research in evolutionary biology. And so he said, please, could you talk about this in your inaugural lecture? And normally an inaugural lecture is a slightly personal take on one's research field, but you don't normally sort of talk about your religious beliefs at length. But he specifically invited me to do so. And of course, I was very happy to, as a Christian. And I thought long and hard about how to address the topic in a way that was relevant to my research and would also be, easily understandable for a diverse audience. And I came up with this idea of laying side by side the idea of the tree of life in evolution and the idea of the tree of life in the Bible. In some ways, they're very, very different concepts. They just have the same name. But I thought if I just lay them side by side and then explain the evidence for each one, then that might help people to understand each other. It might help Christians in the audience to understand the evolutionary biologists, and it might help the evolutionary biologists in the audience to understand the Christians, and maybe everyone in the middle understand both. And so it wasn't I wasn't putting them in direct opposition to each other. I was just sort of comparing and contrasting the case. And I think what it really showed was if you were an atheist listening to that lecture, I think you would come away thinking, well, the evidence for the Darwinian tree of life is a bit weaker than I would have expected, but the evidence for the tree of life in the Bible is a bit stronger than I would have expected. And so maybe there is more reason to think about these things, more reason for dialogue between science and Christianity than maybe people had thought to start with. And then having done that, at the end I said, well, we need to have diversity. We need to be respectful of each other, because quite often what I see and what I hear about in a university context is Christian students who are studying biology will often hear their lecturers and professors saying things that are very negative about Christianity, sometimes mocking Christianity. This is in university lectures, and it actually puts them off of doing biology. I think these lecturers think that they're going to convert them from being a Christian or maybe a Muslim to become an atheist, but actually it doesn't do that. What it does is it puts them off of biology because they think I'm just being mocked, I'm being misunderstood, and I don't want to do this. And I think this is a problem. And so I tried to highlight that as an issue, which isn't necessarily an issue that people have thought about very much before.
So
that goes straight into what we want to discuss with you today. Now, the conflict, or the apparent conflict between Christianity and evolution. Since you mentioned that it's quite unusual for a professor to talk about his own faith in this kind of lecture, I wanted to ask you: is the professor who asked you to do this a Christian himself?
No, he's not. He's just very interested and open-minded.
Interesting, because also in Italy it would be very strange for a professor to give a lecture where he talks about his faith in the way that you did. So,
and so it's good to see that you're trying to be a bridge between the two worlds, and there is space for dialogue. But what was the reaction of those who were there? What response did you have?
There was a real mixture. Some people really enjoyed it and said that was a really good lecture, very interesting, lots to think about. And this it wasn't just Christians who thought it was good. There were a whole diversity of people thought that it was an enjoyable lecture and that there was lots of food for thought there. And there were also some negative responses as well. So some very kind of hardcore atheists were quite upset about it and critiqued it and somewhat misrepresented what I'd said. And The thing that people found most controversial, and this was a surprise to me, the thing that people found most controversial was the way I talked about Christianity, that I said, I think there's evidence that this is true, real world evidence. And one of my colleagues said something really interesting to me. He said, what I didn't like about it was you made your Christianity sound like your science. You made it sound like it's subjectively true. And I said, well, that is exactly the way I view it. I don't turn my mind off when it comes to my Christianity. It's not just about feelings inside. It's about weighing up the evidence, as I do as a scientist, and trying to decide how strong is the evidence and what am I going to believe in response to the evidence. And so I'd outlined the evidence for the truth of the gospel accounts, that they really are, first-hand witnesses accounts of the life of Jesus, and that we've got evidence from Roman historians, Roman documents of the growth of Christianity. And so it all makes sense. There is really strong evidence that this is true. And I thought that it was commonplace for people to realize that Christians have that kind of logic and rationality and evidence for the truth of Christianity. But it turned out that for a lot of scientists, they hadn't really appreciated that. And it comes as a surprise to them. And so that turned out to be the most commented on and even controversial aspect of the lecture. And that was a real surprise to me.
Yeah.
The things I was saying about the Darwinian tree of life, a lot of other biologists are saying this. They're saying it's not really a tree of life. It's more like a network. The evidence is not the way we thought it was 30 years ago. So that although you might think that would be controversial, actually it wasn't particularly controversial, because a lot of scientists are saying the same thing. To my surprise, it was the Christian element that really got the biggest negative reactions.
It's very, very interesting. What we are trying to do with our channel is also a bit this, to show that you can investigate Christianity without turning off your brain. We will come back to that at the end of our conversation. But for now, let's focus on the main topic of our conversation, which is Christianity and evolution. So is there a conflict? And if yes, to what degree there is or there can be a conflict between Christianity and evolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, it boils down to how you define evolution. And evolution is a word with many definitions that means different things to different people. So for me, in my research, evolution is simply a change in allele frequencies in a population over time, where an allele is one particular variant of a gene. And so any change in frequencies of different alleles of genes is evolution. And so if for example, there is an allele in a population that gives resistance to a disease that's killing trees, like, for example, ash trees and ash dieback, a fungus that's killing ash trees across Europe. If there's a gene in the population that's associated with resistance, and there's a particular allele that gives the resistance, if that allele over the next 10 years becomes more frequent in the population because the other trees are dying, and this more resistant tree is not dying and so has more offspring, and its offspring have more offspring, that's a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. That's evolution. Now, of course, there's absolutely no conflict at all between that and Christianity. That is absolutely fine. It's impossible to see a conflict there. Whereas other people would say, well, that's not evolution. What evolution is everything got here by a natural process that had no direction, no intentionality, no purpose. It's just happenstance. Life just happened to originate on this planet or arrive at this planet. No one wanted it to be here. No one had a purpose for it. The fact that conscious, intelligent life like human beings are here, again, just it happened. No one wanted it to happen. It's meaningless. It's purposeless. That's what evolution is. And of course, there's a big conflict between that and Christianity, because Christianity says God wanted us to be here. God wanted human beings to be here. That's why the planet's here. God has something to do, and his son came as a human. So God has a purpose for everything. God is involved in everything. And so depending on how we define evolution, there may or may not be a conflict. And so I find when I'm talking with people about this, I have to say, well, what do you mean by evolution? Because yes, in some ways, some definitions have a conflict and some don't. And what I find is if you don't define it, then if you say, well, I do believe in evolution, they might think that you think that everything got here by a purposeless natural process that did not have us in mind. Whereas if you say, I don't believe in evolution, they'll think he doesn't think alleles can change in frequency in a population, and clearly he's crazy. So I think definitions are really important here. So yes, there is a conflict, but no, there isn't a conflict. And I think some Christians make it harder for themselves by having their own definition of evolution, which is different from the definition of evolution of an evolutionary biologist. So they will say a change in allele frequencies in a population over time, that's not evolution. Well, if you do that and then you say, well, I don't believe in evolution, you've got your own definition of evolution that is not the same as an evolutionary biologist. And so you set yourself up for misunderstanding. It's very, very hard to have a dialogue if you are defining evolution in your own way, unless you explain that very clearly to the person you're talking to.
Do you think it's just a matter of definitions then? Is that why there is this conflict between the two worlds?
I think that's big. Definitions is a big component, definitely. And both sides don't help, because sometimes atheists will sort of equivocate about the meaning of evolution. So you say, well, prove evolution to me, and they'll prove it in terms of changing allele frequencies in a population over time. And then they'll just assume that explains everything about how we got here. But that's a big, big jump. And so that they are sort of equivocating. They'll say, well, I've persuaded you that alleles can change in frequency under natural selection. Now that I've persuaded you of that, I have persuaded you that everything got here by a purposeless natural process. And that's a big leap. So that's unhelpful. But then Christians also can be unhelpful in the way they define evolution and just try to define it. Sometimes some Christians will sort of define it as everything they don't believe in. But then when you actually dig into what they believe in, there's quite a lot of what an evolutionary biologist would call evolution that they do actually believe. Like they'll often believe that natural selection can drive changes in allele frequencies and that kind of thing. So that's one aspect of the perception of a conflict. But I think the other thing is that in the media and in many popular books, atheist scientists will very strongly promote evolution as a kind of apologetic for atheism. So you'll get people like Richard Dawkins in the UK, Jerry Coyne in America, and I'm sure you probably have the equivalents in Italy as well, who will make the case very strongly that evolution is in conflict with Christianity and evolution is correct and Christianity is wrong. And unfortunately, often the most famous biologists that people know of are atheists who are taking that view. And so evolutionary biologists who don't necessarily take that view, either because they just don't think things are that clear, things aren't that tied up, or because they are a Christian or a Muslim or some other faith themselves, they get less airtime And so the public perception of a field like evolutionary biology is so commonly mediated to the public through very vocal atheists. And so that also promotes this idea that there's a massive conflict, and it just has to be one or the other.
Going back to the issue of definitions, I've heard and read several times this difference between macro evolution and micro evolution. Is it something that some Christian made up? Is it a precise, or is it a useful way to understand better what we talk about when we talk about evolution?
Well, that distinction it's not something that was just made up by a Christian. Within evolutionary biology, biologists talk about microevolution and macroevolution. So those are well-known phrases. And yes, I sometimes meet Christians who say, well, I believe in microevolution, but I don't believe in macroevolution. But within biology, macroevolution is everything above the level of speciation, above and including speciation. So evolution is within a species, microevolution is within a species, macroevolution is new species forming, and then everything above that. So in that way, it's not a particularly helpful distinction for a Christian, I don't think, because there is evidence for speciation. So, for example, my postdoctoral research at the University of Florida was on a new species of plant that originated about 100 years ago. It originated via the hybridization of two pre-existing species and a whole genome duplication, a doubling of their chromosomes. And it yielded a new species in that it's a new lineage that doesn't reproduce via crossing with its parents. And so it's reproductively isolated. So it's a new species. So you could say, well, that's macroevolution. And there's very clear evidence that that's true. So even this distinction between micro and macroevolution, it's not a particularly helpful one for Christians to sort of latch onto and think, okay, there's a place where I can draw the line and say, I do believe in this, I don't believe in that. I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me too, from what we have been saying, that the conflict that is there is at least increased in its intensity by an issue of definitions and maybe by a clash of worldviews. But since this thing is there, what is it like being a Christian in the field of evolutionary biology? Are you the only one? Do you face a lot of hostility?
I'm not the only one. There are definitely other Christians there. So it's not as hostile as you might think. Looking at the media, not everyone in evolutionary biology is a vehement atheist. So it's less challenging than you might expect. On the other hand, the majority of people are atheist or agnostic. That the Christians within evolutionary biology are there, but they are a minority, definitely. But the hostility is not as strong as you might imagine. And if you're doing research, if you're publishing good research, people will respect you for the research that you're doing. And the closer people are to the actual research, I find the more respectful they are, because they know that there's room for doubt in many ways. It's the people who know less about biology, who are less engaged in research, who are more intolerant, have a more simplistic view of things. The people who are actually doing the cutting edge research generally are much more tolerant and understanding than the people who are talking to the to the public and writing popular books and that sort of thing, who actually are not doing much research themselves.
Thank you, Richard. Let me ask you another question now. Are there any aspects of life that Darwin's theory struggled to explain? Is there a debate about the issues among scientists?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the origin of life itself is a great mystery, and it can't be explained away by a Darwinian mechanism, because the Darwinian mechanism only works once you have life. You have to have something that can self-replicate before Darwin's mechanism can operate. So the origin of life itself can't be explained through that theory. And it's a big issue, because to have a biological entity that's capable of self-replication it demands something that's actually really complex. And so atheists like Richard Dawkins will end up just saying, well, it was luck. It was a massive, massive dose of luck. The odds were against it, but there are billions of planets in the universe, and we happen to be on the lucky one. So I don't find that a very persuasive argument at all. No one really has a comprehensive theory for the origin of life, where and in many ways the field is, the more we discover, the harder it seems to be that life could just spontaneously originate from non-life. So that's one issue. Another issue is the issue of human consciousness. We don't even know how human consciousness works. We don't know what the relationship is really between the mind and the brain. How do we have the consciousness that we do? If we can't even explain how it works, we're even further away from explaining how it evolved. And there are reasons in principle to think this would be very hard to explain by a Darwinian mechanism, because Darwin's theory is all about survival and reproduction. The ones who can survive better and reproduce better are the ones who win, and they pass on their genes. But, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, they all managed to survive and reproduce fine. So what was it that drove us to have this just extraordinary cognitive ability, and not only have that cognitive ability, but also have a strong sense of right and wrong, a strong sense of justice, love? Often our cognitive abilities are actually holding us back from doing things which in a Darwinian sense are beneficial. They're holding us back from having a very large number of children, for instance. That they're holding us back from just being promiscuous. Our sense of morality is in a Darwinian sense hindering our survival and reproduction. So how did it evolve? I think that it's very hard to explain in a Darwinian fashion. And as I say, it's something that demands a great deal of explanation. So that's two things. The origin of life and the origin of consciousness, they are both really hard to explain. And there are other aspects of life as well that are also very hard to explain.
But did ever Darwin claim that his theory would explain the beginning of life, or he didn't get to that?
No, I don't think Darwin did. But then again, you have to remember that in 1859, the year that he published The Origin of Species, it was the same year when scientists showed for the first time that spontaneous generation of life doesn't happen. So before then, some people thought, well, if you just leave a loaf of bread in a cupboard, life will just spontaneously appear there in the form of mold and fungus. But then Louis Pasteur showed, no, that's not the case. You have to have the germs in there of these things. It's not new life. It's spores germinating. So, before then, the origin of life seemed really simple. It seemed to be happening all the time, all around. But then Pasteur showed no, that's not happening. And then over the years, we've understood more and more how complex something has to be in order to fit into the category of being alive and being able to self-replicate. So Darwin didn't claim that his theory explained this, but then again, it wasn't such a big problem in his day.
Yeah, I think I've seen something else on your blog. Was it Darwin most horrendous mystery or something like that? Is that some...
Darwin's abominable mystery?
Yes, abominable. Yeah. Is that something else that would refer to as something that Darwin's theory struggles to explain today?
Yeah, so that Darwin called the origin of the higher plants an abominable mystery, and it's still a mystery today. It's an unsolved mystery, and in some ways, it's actually a deeper mystery than it was in his time. So that's another example of an area where Darwin could see this was problematic for his theory. The fossils of what he called the higher plants just appear very suddenly in the fossil record in the Cretaceous. And in essence, this is a very broad simplification. In essence, they still do, and it's still unexplained by a gradualistic evolutionary mechanism such as Darwin had in mind.
I wasn't celebrating the fact that there is one more problem for Darwin's theory. I was just saying, great, you can dig more into this, going to Richard Bugg's blog and reading the article. There's also a lecture, I think, on this topic. So if you want to know more, go there and look into that.
There will be a link in the description for this blog as well.
Yeah. But going back...
I've also written a couple of scientific papers about it in the scientific literature.
So if you are able to read scientific literature on biology, then you might want to check that
in English, of course.
In English. But today, with the AE systems that we have, I suppose you can translate
easily.
But going back to the issue of consciousness, it seems to me that that's already into our next question, which is about human beings. Can our origin be explained purely by evolutionary mechanisms?
Well, I think the answer at the moment definitely is we have not explained it purely by evolutionary mechanisms. As I say, consciousness, we don't really even know how it works, let alone how it evolved. And I think it's really very hard to see how in the future the progress of science will lead us to think actually this could have come about by an unguided natural process. Because, as I say, survival and reproduction are not something that's necessarily enhanced by our ability to think in moral terms and have that appreciation of the world that our human consciousness gives to us. So I would say we haven't explained the origin of human consciousness in purely naturalistic terms, and it's seems to me very unlikely that we ever could.
You said before, at the moment we haven't. I like that. When you say at the moment, you mean that you're still open to that means that you're not sticking to a position regardless what's discovered. You're actually open to
we always have to be aware that science is constantly changing. We have to try to come up with an accurate assessment of where we are today and be honest and clear about what we do and we don't know today. But we have to also be mindful that science is constantly changing and that something that scientists believe today might not be something they believe in the future. But now I find that atheists will often sort of use that fact and say, well, okay, we don't understand this now, but I'm sure that in the future we will explain all of this away, because science is constantly progressing and we're always explaining more and more and more. And so I'm sure that in 200 years' time, we'll understand, for example, how human consciousness could have evolved by a natural process. But I think we have to look very carefully at the history of science and say, well, yeah, we're constantly making progress, but does that always mean that we're showing how things could have evolved by natural processes? And I don't think it is, because, you know, if you look at the history of our understanding of an issue like the origin of life, well, I'd argue that the problem is getting bigger, not smaller. And to some extent, that's also true of Darwin's abominable mystery. You know, in some ways, the mystery has got deeper, not shallower. And I think there are numerous other aspects of life where, in many ways, science is moving away from where an atheist would want it to be moving. But at the very least, I would want to say to an atheist, look, okay, you think that in 200 years' time, this will be explained and God will be out of the picture. That is a statement of faith. You have faith in the future progress of science. I have faith in God. You have faith in the future progress of science. But if you're wrong, and in 200 years' time, this hasn't been explained, and in fact, every scientist says, I think God must have been involved here because we haven't explained it. Well, that's too late for you because you're no longer around. So we have to be clear that it is a faith position to say, I think this will be solved by future science. And I would argue it's not a faith position that is necessarily strongly supported by the evidence either, because it's a very simplistic view of science to say it's simply solving all of these issues and explaining everything in a naturalistic way.
Thank you, Richard. It's very, very interesting. And one way in which this issue of human origin comes into conflict with the gospel, according to some of our friends at least, is Adam and Eve, the existence of Adam and Eve. So some of our friends in the comments under our videos repeatedly, they often say that science has undoubtedly demonstrated that Adam and Eve never existed. Is that true?
No, that's not true. The reason why some people say that is because there have been claims that the present diversity, the genetic diversity of the human population of the world today cannot be explained if we once came through a bottleneck of two individuals. You know, they say, well, there's just too much diversity out there for us ever to have come just from two people. And this is an argument actually made by the American atheist Jerry Coyne in his book, Fact versus Faith. And he says, well, there are studies which have estimated the effective population size of the human population in the past, and these never show it dipping down to two individuals. Therefore, we've disproven Adam and Eve. But when you look closely at the methods used in those studies, and some of these methods are methods that I've used in my own research, when you look at these methods, you find, well, actually, they wouldn't pick up on a bottleneck of two individuals. If there was rapid population expansion after those two individuals, then you simply wouldn't pick up on that bottleneck. You only pick up on a bottleneck if it's two individuals for many generations. Then you get lots of inbreeding and you end up with very little genetic variation. But if you have two individuals who then reproduce and have loads of children, loads of grandchildren, loads of great-grandchildren, you maintain all of the diversity that was within those two individuals. And two individuals can hold huge amounts of diversity, because you'll know that DNA has 4 letters in it. We often call them A, T, G, and C. And two individuals contain 4 copies of the human genome. We each have one from our mum and one from our dad. And our partner will have one from their mum, one from their dad. So there's 4 copies of the human genome in any human couple. And there are 4 letters of DNA. 4 letters. So it's possible to have all 4 possible variants at any single site within a single couple. So the amount of variation that can be carried is absolutely huge. So we haven't disproven the existence of Adam and Eve through these type of genetic studies that people like Jerry Coyne would claim have disproven them, and actually it's a big mistake to do so. And there are some Christians who have sort of picked up on those arguments made by Coyne and made them to a Christian audience and said, look, everyone, we've got to give up on a literal Adam and Eve. But people like that have now acknowledged actually that was wrong. We misunderstood the studies and the methods, and actually they don't disprove the existence of a single couple who we all originate from. You can find that argument summarized in a recent book by William Lane Craig on the historical Adam. But there's also there's material about it on my website as well, and a video I've done with a short lecture about the topic.
Thank you. Previously in this conversation, you mentioned also Richard Dawkins, globally famous British atheist. In his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he wrote that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Do you agree with this statement?
No, I don't. So he says that before Darwin published The Origin of Species, you couldn't really be an atheist, and at least not an intellectually fulfilled one. But since it's been possible, and that's because before Darwin, the only thing that people could invoke apart from God to explain the origins of complexity in the biological world was just pure chance. And so his argument is, well, you can't believe in that much luck. But what Darwin's theory does is it eliminates a lot of the luck. It gives us a mechanism where you just need small amounts of luck, and then natural selection is selecting among those lucky events. And it eliminates so much luck that we can actually believe it. But then when you actually look at what he believes, he thinks that a lot of luck was involved in the origin of life, a massive amount of luck. He says there was a massive amount of luck at the origin of the eukaryotic cell. There was a massive amount of luck in the origin of human consciousness. And then he says maybe there are other transitions that took a huge amount of luck. And so actually, when you really look at what he still believes in massive amounts of luck, even though he makes a really big deal of the elimination of luck by the Darwinian mechanism. And added to that, ancient Greeks who thought that everything could just be explained by luck, and there were some, they thought that the universe was infinitely large and infinitely old. Whereas today, everyone believes the universe had a beginning and it's finite in size. And so luck is actually even less compelling as an argument now than it was for people before Darwin, like the ancient Greeks. So in many ways, I think it's harder today to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist than it was 2,000 years ago.
And that links us to another question, which is maybe broader. Since many people have this idea that before modern science, everybody believed in God. And then when modern science appeared and started to make progress in explaining the nature that we perceive, the room for faith and for God is decreasing. Do you think that in the future, with science progressing more and more, it will be harder for people to be Christians? And
no, I don't, and I would dispute that sort of view of history that there's been this sort of progress that has driven people towards atheism. I think there have always been atheists. There were ancient Greeks who thought that everything had come about by chance, as I was just saying, and in many ways, the scientific revolution was driven by Christianity. It arose out of a Christian context. People believed in a lawgiver, and so they started looking for laws of nature. They believed in God, and they believed that we are created in God's image. And so they thought, well, we can start thinking God's thoughts after him. We can actually understand the mechanisms, how these things work. And so I think science and Christianity very much go hand in hand. And the more we understand, the more it actually reflects on God and how great and how wise and how good and how intelligent he is and how powerful he is. And in many ways, I would see the progress of science as actually making that case stronger and stronger. I think the argument that God is just being eliminated is not really an accurate one. Now, of course, you do get superstitious beliefs, like a superstitious idea that, maybe, things that there may have been people in the past who believed that certain things that now can be fully explained by science, like lightning and thunder, previously were sort of supernatural events. But I think that's mere superstition. And of course, it's sort of good when superstition is eliminated, and Christians have always been in favor of eliminating mere superstition. But that the idea that there is a God and that he is the one behind everything, the intelligence, the one who gives purpose and meaning and direction to everything, I think that is the argument for his existence is actually stronger than ever because of the progress of modern science.
Thank you. We actually have a last question for you. So far, we've been talking about, in a very generic way, about the existence of God. But then for a Christian, it doesn't stop there. We believe in the Gospels as well. We believe in the person of Jesus as the center of the Christian faith. And of course, we read in the Gospels of supernatural things that Jesus performed. And the main one that really we could say is at the center of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Jesus. So some people may say that as a scientist, you should not believe in the resurrection. And maybe they will say, don't push it that far. Okay, existence of God, but Jesus' resurrection, how can that be possible? How would you respond to that?
Well, yeah, some people would say, well, as a scientist, you should just rule out anything that's supernatural from the outset. That's a scientific frame of mind. I disagree. I think that's a philosophical position. I think a scientific frame of mind is to say, I want to look at the evidence and I want to follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's, to me, that is the essence of science. And I think if we look at the evidence for the resurrection, if we look at the evidence for Jesus' miracles, actually, it is quite compelling evidence. People will say, well, the gospel accounts, they've evolved over a large number of centuries. And to start with, people were just writing about Jesus as a great teacher. And then hundreds of years later, people added in all this stuff about miracles. But actually, if you look at what we now know about the manuscript evidence for the Gospels, we have found older and older and older parchments, which are of the Gospels with all of the supernatural stuff in. So this argument that the Gospels sort of evolved over time is becoming less and less credible. And we have to explain how Christianity took off in the 1st and 2nd century AD. And there's good evidence outside of the Bible that it did. How did that happen? If people were talking about miracles, but those miracles never happened, and people could easily talk to other people and discover that those miracles didn't happen. So I think actually there's a very strong case that these historical documents are actually true. Now you might say, well, that's the area of a historian, not of a scientist. And in a sense it is, but then most of my time as a scientist, I am reading what other people have have written about what they've seen and what they've done and weighing up whether I think it's plausible. So most of my beliefs as a scientist are based on the testimony of other people. And so, you know, in a sense, that's what I do when I'm coming at the Gospels. I'm saying, is this plausible? What are they trying to prove to me? And what evidence would be sufficient to prove to me what they're trying to prove? And if someone is trying to prove that Jesus is the Son of God, then I think it would take miracles to prove that. That is the sort of evidence that would be adequate. And I think there's a strong case that those miracles actually did take place, and Jesus really is God made flesh. He really was the creator come to earth in human form. That is where the evidence leads. And so I think as a scientist, I should follow that evidence.
So as a scientist, you can accept that God can perform miracles if that's God intervening.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I don't know if Francesco wanted to add something.
No, I think that's a perfect conclusion for our conversation with Richard. You helped us a lot to understand more about evolution and the conflict between evolution and Christianity, which shouldn't be a conflict.
The apparent conflict.
Yes. But then we ended up what we care more about on our channel, which is getting people closer to Jesus and to the testimonies about Jesus that we have in the Bible. It was nice to hear that from a scientific point of view or mindset, you still can approach the gospel and investigate them to know what is true, not just to do a leap of faith and believe what it's not believable. That's not our approach on our channel. That's not what Richard presented to us, and that's what we invite you to do every time we can.
Richard, we mentioned before your blog. What can people find on your blog? We put a link on the description. But what can people find there?
Yeah, do feel free to visit it. It's not very professional, but there's articles there on Adam and Eve, on the evidence for God, some responses to people like Richard Dawkins, various materials in the blog. Just scroll through, and there's some videos linked on YouTube as well on various topics. So yeah, I do hope that's helpful.
Well, we thank you very, very much, and we leave it to people to comment under this video, and
ask them to be respectful and nice, even when they strongly disagree. Do it with respect.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.